It was a crisp morning in November 2012 at Stanford University, the iconic campus known for its intellectual vibrancy and its picturesque, sprawling grounds. The cool breeze whispered through the towering redwoods, seemingly unaware of the storm that was about to engulf the academic community. The students bustled across the quad, preparing for finals, but everything paused when the call came through. Professor Robert Sinclair, the esteemed professor of psychology, was dead. His lifeless body was discovered slumped behind his desk in his office, his face pale, his hands cold, an image that would haunt the halls of the university for years to come. But as the police arrived, it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary death. This was murder. Sinclair, a respected figure in the field of emotional trauma and behavioral psychology, had taught thousands over his distinguished career. He had built a reputation for his insight into the complexities of the human mind, for his ability to read people in ways that seemed almost supernatural. But now, all those accolades, all that praise, seemed meaningless in the face of what had just happened. His reputation, it seemed, had come at a great cost. The discovery of Sinclair's body sent shockwaves through the campus, and news of his death spread like wildfire. It was a scandal in the making, but no one could have predicted the depth of the secrets that would soon be revealed. Within hours, whispers began circulating about a young student, a transgender woman named Isabella Carter, whose name had been linked to the professor. The media pounced on the story, but there was more to the tale than anyone could imagine. What started as an academic scandal was about to turn into something much darker, much more sinister. As the police began their investigation, Isabella's name was the first to surface. She was the last person to be seen entering Sinclair's office on the evening of March 12, just hours before his body was discovered. The authorities had little to go on, but one thing was certain: Isabella had a secret. A secret so explosive that it could shatter her life forever. Isabella Carter, a quiet psychology major with a troubled past, had always felt like an outsider. Born Isaac Carter, she grew up in a small, conservative town in Utah, a place where conformity was prized and anything different was cast aside. She had struggled for years with her identity, never feeling comfortable in her own skin. At 18, after years of turmoil and self-doubt, she made the difficult decision to leave home, to leave the family that refused to accept her, and head for the welcoming, more liberal embrace of Stanford. In her first year at the university, Isabella met Robert Sinclair. He was her professor, someone who appeared to understand her struggles in ways no one else had. What started as a typical student-professor relationship soon grew into something more. Sinclair, in his late 40s, offered Isabella guidance, reassurance, and, she believed, acceptance. He had promised her that she was brave, that she was finally becoming the woman she was meant to be. His words were a balm to her wounded heart, and she clung to them. But what Isabella didn't know, what no one knew, was that Sinclair's motivations were far darker than they seemed. Under the guise of mentorship, he had begun to manipulate her, to feed off her insecurities, using her vulnerability as a means of control. What had begun as a lifeline for Isabella soon became a trap, and she was caught in its snare. Now, as the investigation unfolded, the world was about to discover the true nature of their secret, one that would change everything. As the day wore on, Isabella remained under suspicion, caught in a storm of accusations and media frenzy. But there was one question that lingered in the air: did she kill him? Isabella Carter's story didn't begin at Stanford, nor did it start with the murder of Robert Sinclair. It began in the small town of Harrisville, nestled in the rugged hills of Utah, a place where every street corner seemed to echo with tradition and old-fashioned values. Harrisville was a town where the norm was expected, where conformity was key, and where those who were different were quietly erased or ignored. From a young age, Isaac Carter, as he had been known then, felt the sharp sting of being an outsider. He didn't fit in the mold that society and, more importantly, his family, had set for him. As a boy, Isaac was sensitive. He didn't like playing football like the other boys did, and his interests often leaned toward quieter, more introspective things like reading and painting. He was the kind of child who preferred solitude to the bustling noise of the playground, a trait his father often chastised him for. The pressure of living up to his family's expectations was suffocating. The Carters were deeply religious, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they held their beliefs tightly. The idea of gender fluidity or the concept of being transgender was alien to them. Isaac's parents were loving but rigid, their world shaped by a faith that allowed little room for anything outside its prescribed norms. When Isaac began to show signs of not fitting the expected mold of masculinity, it didn't go unnoticed. His mother often whispered about his peculiarities to friends at church, while his father, a strict man, would often mutter about Isaac needing to be a man and stop acting so weak. At the age of 13, Isaac knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. He wasn't just a confused boy or a late bloomer. He wasn't just struggling with adolescence. He was battling something far deeper, his true identity. But no one could understand, especially not his family. They loved him, but they simply couldn't grasp the truth he was trying to understand about himself. They couldn't see the girl trapped inside the boy they had raised. The conflict inside Isaac only grew more intense as the years passed. He tried his best to fit in, to pretend he was the son they wanted, the boy who could excel in sports, who could follow the strictures of the church and of family tradition. But the more he tried to hide who he really was, the more suffocating the world became. It was a slow suffocation, a tightening of his chest every time he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The image that stared back wasn't just of a young man on the verge of adulthood, it was a foreign reflection of someone who didn't belong in that skin. By the time he turned 18, Isaac's internal struggle had reached its breaking point. He knew he couldn't stay in Harrisville, couldn't endure another year of living in a place that rejected who he truly was. His family, though they loved him deeply, could not accept the truth he had come to understand: he was not Isaac, not in the way they thought. He was Isabella, a woman trapped in a boy's body. But the words felt like nails on a chalkboard, too painful to speak, too terrifying to admit. So, with a heavy heart and a suitcase full of dreams, Isaac Carter left Utah behind and headed west to Stanford University. The journey was not just a physical escape, it was a mental one as well. Isabella, as she would soon become, knew that Stanford represented freedom, a chance to finally breathe, to express who she was without the confines of her past life. But escaping the stifling atmosphere of Utah was not as simple as moving across state lines. The memories of her family's rejection haunted her in ways she could not shake. Each step forward, every new experience at Stanford, was both a liberation and a constant reminder of what she had left behind. At Stanford, Isabella found a semblance of peace in a community that, though imperfect, allowed her to breathe. She found kindred spirits, professors who encouraged her to embrace her truth, and a sense of belonging that she had never felt before. But there was still a void. The weight of the years spent hiding her true self left scars that were not easily healed by the open-mindedness of the university. It was in this fragile state of emotional vulnerability that she met Professor Robert Sinclair. He was not just a professor to her, he was the first person who made her feel understood, who seemed to see her for who she was beneath the surface. He offered her the reassurance and acceptance she so desperately needed, and she clung to it like a lifeline. Sinclair, with his kind words and patient listening, seemed to offer exactly what Isabella had been searching for her entire life: validation, affection, and a sense of safety. But what began as a simple mentor-mentee relationship began to shift in ways Isabella didn't fully understand. Her need for affection, compounded by years of rejection, made her vulnerable. And Robert Sinclair, while offering solace, began to take advantage of that vulnerability. Slowly, insidiously, he began to use the very power he had as a professor to control her, to manipulate her emotions and insecurities. The man she had once looked up to, the man who seemed to understand her better than anyone, was the same man who was now taking away the last semblance of control she had over her own life. Isabella's story, though still new to Stanford, was already written in the scars of her past, a past she couldn't fully escape, not yet. The ghosts of Utah still lingered, and they would soon haunt her in ways she never could have imagined. In the spring of 2011, Isabella began the long and painful process of transitioning from Isaac to the woman she had always known herself to be. She had arrived at Stanford with dreams of freedom, but now, more than ever, those dreams were weighted by the heavy burden of becoming truly herself. The journey was not just about hormones and medical procedures, it was a deep, emotional reckoning with the very fabric of her identity. For years, she had lived in the shadows of her own skin, pretending to be the person the world expected, while silently longing for something else. The isolation she had felt as Isaac had been soul-crushing. Now, as Isabella, she was fighting for the courage to step into the light. The weight of the decision was unimaginable, but the feeling of finally being able to embrace her identity, though terrifying, was exhilarating. The first steps were the hardest. Isabella had grown used to the looks, the whispers, the subtle but sharp rejection from her past. Yet, Stanford's more open-minded, diverse environment offered a modicum of relief. Still, she was not immune to the stares from strangers, the whispers in hallways, and the quiet judgment from those who didn't understand her transition. There were moments when she wondered if she would ever truly be accepted. In those moments, the weight of loneliness threatened to pull her under again. It was during this delicate period of transition that Robert Sinclair, her professor and mentor, became more than just a guiding figure, he became her sanctuary. He was the first person at Stanford to understand her, or so she thought. His words, so kind and validating, were the balm she desperately needed. Sinclair, a man in his late 40s, had built a career around understanding the human mind, the vulnerabilities, the fears, the dark corners that people often kept hidden. When he first encountered Isabella in his psychology class, something about her pain resonated with him. He saw past the surface, past the insecurities and the hesitations, and saw someone who was struggling to reconcile her outward appearance with her inner self. He recognized a raw vulnerability in her, one that was familiar, one that seemed to cry out for guidance. Their first few conversations were professional, academic in nature, centered around Isabella's work in the class. But soon, Sinclair's questions became more personal, his concern more apparent. He asked about her childhood, her journey, questions that reached into the depths of her soul. To Isabella, his interest seemed like kindness, genuine care. But to Sinclair, it was an opportunity. He began to position himself as her protector, the one person who could truly understand the turmoil she faced. Their relationship deepened, at first in the subtle ways that often characterize a mentorship: long talks after class, emails filled with thoughtful advice, occasional meetings where they would discuss her emotional struggles. To Isabella, these conversations felt like lifelines, saving her from drowning in a sea of isolation. Sinclair's attention made her feel seen, valued in ways she hadn't felt before. It was intoxicating, a taste of the acceptance she had been denied for so long. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift. Sinclair's interest in Isabella started to cross the boundaries of mentorship. His compliments, though seemingly innocent at first, grew more personal. He told her she was brave for transitioning, that she was finally becoming the person she was meant to be. But the words, so encouraging on the surface, began to feel like strings being pulled, leading Isabella deeper into a web she couldn't see. Isabella, starved for validation, clung to his every word. Her emotions, raw and vulnerable after years of rejection, made her an easy target. She began to trust him completely, believing that his attention and approval were signs of love, of care, things she had never truly experienced. Sinclair, in turn, began to manipulate that trust. He would gently remind her that their relationship had to remain a secret. The world was not ready to accept her, especially not their relationship. It would destroy both of them, he warned, if anyone found out. The secrecy was suffocating. What started as mentorship had blurred into something darker, something that Isabella couldn't fully comprehend. At first, she was hesitant, unsure whether to cross those lines. But Sinclair was persuasive, his need for secrecy matched her own fears. She had never been public about her transition, had never openly admitted the truth to her family. Sinclair, in his twisted form of protection, had found a way to create a space where Isabella's vulnerability was both nurtured and controlled. By January 2011, their relationship had transformed from a mentor-mentee dynamic into something far more complicated, an affair. Isabella was emotionally tethered to Sinclair, unable to break free from the tight grip he had on her sense of self. The secrecy, the manipulation, the promises of a love that never came to light, it all became a tangled mess of confusion, fear, and longing. Isabella began to question her worth, her identity. Was she truly becoming the person she was meant to be, or was she simply becoming what Sinclair wanted her to be? The doubt started to creep in, and with them came the realization that Sinclair was no longer the compassionate mentor she had once believed him to be. He was using her, feeding off her insecurities, using her need for affection as a tool to control her. But Isabella didn't have the strength to break away. She had never been shown love in the way Sinclair had promised. She had never been accepted in the way she desperately needed. For all his manipulation, Sinclair had provided her with something no one else had ever given her, the illusion of love. And to Isabella, it felt like the only thing worth holding on to. As the months wore on, the tension between them grew, reaching a boiling point in early March 2011. Isabella was trapped in the web Sinclair had woven, and she could see no way out. The man who had promised her love and acceptance had become the very person who held her in chains. But she didn't know how to escape. She was stuck, lost in the turmoil of emotion Sinclair had so expertly manipulated. Isabella thought she had finally found someone who saw her, someone who understood her struggles. What she didn't know was that the man she had come to trust was the very person who would eventually lead her down a path she couldn't undo. As the weeks turned into months, the dynamic between Isabella Carter and Professor Robert Sinclair shifted from one of quiet mentorship to an increasingly toxic, manipulative affair. What began as an innocent teacher-student relationship had morphed into something darker, something that Isabella couldn't fully understand, or was too afraid to acknowledge. What Sinclair had started with kindness and patience, he was now turning into a power play, using Isabella's vulnerabilities to keep her tethered to him. Sinclair was a master at understanding the human psyche, his expertise in emotional trauma and manipulation a double-edged sword. He knew how to make Isabella feel seen in a world that had rejected her, how to make her feel loved, even when the love he offered was nothing more than a form of control. But it was hard for Isabella to see this at the time. Her own need for acceptance, for validation, clouded her judgment. All she had ever wanted was to be understood, to be loved for who she truly was. And Sinclair had given her that illusion. His words were honeyed, sweet and reassuring. "You are so brave, Isabella," he would tell her. "You are finally becoming the woman you were always meant to be." But these words, so comforting, so warm, were not meant to build her up. They were meant to tie her closer to him. Every compliment, every kind word, felt like a lifeline she couldn't afford to let go of. And with each passing day, Sinclair's hold on her grew tighter. He knew how to play on her insecurities. As the weeks went by, their secret relationship began to deepen. Sinclair would often remind Isabella that their connection could never be public. "The world isn't ready for you yet," he'd say. "If they find out, they will destroy everything we've built." These words planted seeds of fear in Isabella's mind, making her believe that any disclosure of their relationship would not only cost them their careers but would also leave her open to harsh judgment. The university was progressive, yes, but the world, according to Sinclair, was not ready to accept someone like her. And so, the secrecy grew, suffocating the very thing Isabella had believed would set her free. She became more isolated, more dependent on Sinclair's approval. "Just a little longer," he would whisper, reassuring her that things would get better, that their relationship would eventually be accepted, but only if they kept it hidden, only if she continued to comply with his rules. But the rules weren't just about keeping their relationship a secret. Sinclair's control began to creep into every corner of Isabella's life. He controlled how she felt about herself. He had planted the idea that she was too fragile, too vulnerable, to exist outside the confines of their secret. "You need me," he told her, "you can't survive in this world without me." At first, Isabella believed him. She was still a young woman in the process of rediscovering herself. The scars from her family's rejection and her years of living as someone she wasn't still ran deep. To her, Sinclair's attention was the only affection she had ever known. But soon, she began to realize that the validation he offered came at a cost. Every compliment he gave her, every word of encouragement, had an unspoken condition attached. "Stay hidden," he would say, his tone gentle but firm. "If anyone finds out, it will ruin us both." In Sinclair's eyes, Isabella had become little more than an object to be controlled, a possession he kept locked away. Every time she tried to assert herself, every time she questioned their secrecy, he would gently remind her of the consequences. The fear of exposure, the fear of rejection from the world, and from him, kept her in check. The lines between affection and manipulation blurred. Sinclair no longer treated Isabella as a student or even as a person to be respected. She was a project, an extension of his own desires and ego. The promise of love he had given her was now just a tool for keeping her compliant. "No one will understand you like I do," he would say, his voice low and soothing, as if that made everything all right. Isabella, trapped in her need for acceptance, began to lose herself. The identity she had fought so hard to build, the woman she was becoming, started to fade behind the mask that Sinclair had imposed on her. She had longed for someone to accept her, but in doing so, she had let someone take away her autonomy, her independence. What she thought was love had slowly turned into a cage. By March 2011, Isabella's sense of self had become increasingly distorted. She began to doubt her worth. Was she truly the person Sinclair had promised her she was, or was she just a reflection of his desires? The constant need for approval from him, the fear of exposure, and the suffocating secrecy had left her emotionally drained and isolated. What had started as a chance for freedom, her transition, was now a constant battle for control, a fight she wasn't sure she could win. Yet, she couldn't leave. Not yet. She had no one else to turn to. The promise of love from Sinclair, though manipulative and cruel, was still the only thing that had ever felt like belonging. And so, she stayed. The power dynamics between them had shifted irreparably. What had once been a sanctuary for Isabella had become a prison. Sinclair had succeeded in doing exactly what he had set out to do. He had made her believe that she couldn't live without him, that she would crumble without his approval, without his guidance. And Isabella, terrified of being left in the cold, held on tighter to him, even as he tightened the chains that bound her. By March 2011, Isabella was standing at the edge of a precipice she could no longer ignore. Her entire life, for the past several months, had been shaped by Robert Sinclair, by his words, his demands, and his promises. But the weight of the lies, the secrecy, and the emotional manipulation had begun to crush her, suffocating the woman she was struggling to become. The world had always felt like an oppressive, unforgiving place to Isabella, but now, it felt even more so. She had left Harrisville for freedom, only to be caught in another kind of prison. Sinclair, the one person who had offered her the illusion of acceptance, had become the very thing that kept her trapped. His voice, once comforting, had begun to sound like chains rattling against her very soul. Each time he told her to keep their relationship hidden, to never let anyone see them together, she felt the walls closing in around her. The secrecy that once seemed like protection now felt like a suffocating blanket, smothering her every breath. Every conversation between them had become laced with tension. "You don't understand how dangerous it is," Sinclair would remind her, his tone as gentle as it was commanding. "The world isn't ready for us." But with each passing day, the lines between love and control grew more blurred. It wasn't just that she had to hide their relationship, it was that she had to hide herself. Her very identity, her being, was a secret he insisted on keeping locked away. The woman she was trying to become was slowly being erased by the very person who had promised to help her find herself. Yet, despite the fear and the growing frustration inside her, Isabella stayed. There was no one else. The weight of her family's rejection, the fear of being alone in a world that refused to understand her, and the false sense of safety that Sinclair provided, these things kept her anchored to him. Love, she thought, must feel like this: pain, confusion, and a deep-seated need for validation. But as Sinclair's emotional demands grew, so did the tension between them. She had given him everything she had: her trust, her affection, her vulnerability. And still, it was never enough. The more she clung to him, the more he pulled away. He began to withdraw emotionally, no longer offering the same words of encouragement, the same comforting presence he had once given her. Instead, there was only silence, punctuated by sharp, dismissive comments. The emotional distance between them was now impossible to ignore. It was as though he had drained her of everything he needed, leaving her exposed and empty. The fear of being abandoned, of losing the only connection she had, loomed over her like a dark cloud. On the evening of March 5, everything came to a head. Sinclair had called her into his office under the pretext of discussing her academic progress, but there was an unspoken tension hanging in the air, something more than the usual academic concerns. Isabella entered his office, her heart racing, unsure of what was about to unfold. It was supposed to be a routine meeting, but as soon as she stepped inside, she could feel the shift. There was no warmth in his greeting, no reassuring words. Sinclair was distant, cold, his usual soft gaze now hardened with something Isabella couldn't place. They sat across from each other, and the words that passed between them were clipped, terse. There was an undertone of finality to everything he said. He told her that they needed to stop. The relationship, the secrecy, everything. He claimed that it was for her own good, that it couldn't continue. Isabella felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath her. She had known, deep down, that this day would come, the day Sinclair would cast her aside, just as she had always feared. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. She wasn't ready to lose the one person who had ever made her feel like she mattered. Her voice wavered as she tried to argue, tried to cling to the connection they had. She begged him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to lose him, not after everything she had been through. But Sinclair was firm, his expression impassive. He didn't want her anymore, not in the way she had believed, not in the way she needed. The emotional manipulation had served its purpose, and now it was time for him to let go. As she left his office that night, a flood of emotions overwhelmed her: hurt, confusion, rage, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. She had thought their bond was real, but it had all been an illusion. The man she had trusted, the man who had promised her love and acceptance, had used her. He had taken everything he needed from her, her trust, her affection, and now, he was discarding her, leaving her broken. The following days were a blur of emotions, of desperately trying to make sense of what had happened. Sinclair's coldness, his abandonment, haunted her. She became consumed by thoughts of what had gone wrong, what had happened to their relationship. The secret, the lies, they had been so much a part of her life that without them, she felt lost. She tried to push through her academic work, to focus on the lectures and the assignments, but nothing felt real anymore. It was as if the very foundation of her identity had been shattered, and there was no one left to help her pick up the pieces. Then, on March 8, the police arrived. They had already been investigating Sinclair's death, and now, the focus shifted toward Isabella. She had been the last person seen with him, and the questions began. Did she kill him? The words echoed in her mind as she was questioned, as the walls seemed to close in around her. She could feel the weight of suspicion pressing down on her chest, choking her. As the days passed, Isabella realized the horrific truth, the emotional manipulation, the secrecy, the fear, it had all led to this moment. She wasn't just the victim of a toxic relationship, she was now trapped in a web of lies, with no way out. It was the morning of March 8, just 3 days after their final, crushing encounter, when the news reached Isabella. The university was buzzing with rumors, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. Professor Robert Sinclair was dead. He had been found in his office, his body slumped behind his desk. No one knew how he had died, but the shock was immediate. No one could fathom that someone so respected, so seemingly untouchable, could be gone. Isabella, still reeling from the heartbreak of the previous days, was sitting in her dorm room when she first heard the news. The silence in her heart was deafening. Sinclair, the man she had given everything to, was gone. The cold, distant man who had manipulated her, controlled her, and ultimately discarded her, was dead. The weight of his absence settled heavily in her chest, but amidst the confusion, a darker, more sinister realization began to form. She hadn't seen him since their last meeting, yet she couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something was off, something about his death didn't add up. Was it truly natural? Or was it, somehow, connected to their fractured relationship? Her mind raced, spinning in a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and doubt. She had been the last one to see him alive. Had he known she was about to walk away from their twisted connection? Had that been the final straw? It wasn't long before the police arrived at Stanford, quickly setting up a perimeter around Sinclair's office. The campus, once vibrant and full of life, now felt oppressive, haunted by the lingering questions surrounding the professor's untimely death. Investigators combed through Sinclair's office, searching for answers, any shred of evidence that could explain the circumstances of his passing. The university was in turmoil. Whispers of scandal were rife. Some students and faculty members were already speculating that his death had something to do with his private life, his relationships with students, his closeness to certain individuals. Sinclair's reputation, once unblemished, now hung in the balance. What secrets had he been hiding? And most importantly, what was the true cause of his death? Isabella was soon called in for questioning. The detectives were courteous but persistent, asking her about her last interactions with Sinclair. They knew she had been with him the day before his death, and their questions grew more pointed with each passing minute. Isabella tried to remain composed, but her mind raced. What would they find out? What would happen if they learned about the nature of her relationship with Sinclair? The affair, the manipulation, the lies, all of it would come crashing down. She told them the truth as best as she could. She had been in Sinclair's office for a meeting about her academic progress. She had stayed afterward, discussing her emotional struggles, but she left before the evening came to an end. It was a routine tutoring session, she explained, nothing more. She did not mention their affair, the deep emotional connection they had shared, nor the way Sinclair had used her vulnerability against her. The investigators pressed her for more details, but Isabella remained tight-lipped. She knew that once the nature of their relationship became public, everything would change. The community would turn on her. She would be vilified. It wasn't just the scandal that terrified her, it was the potential backlash, the fear of being seen as the villain in a story that no one could understand. The truth felt too dangerous, too painful to reveal. As the investigation deepened, more details about Sinclair's double life began to surface. He had been a respected professor by day, but by night, he had been hiding a dark secret, a secret that included not only Isabella but also other students whom he had manipulated. The police uncovered emails, journals, and private notes that painted a disturbing picture of Sinclair's emotional control over his students. His charm, his patient guidance, had been the perfect disguise for his manipulation. To the outside world, he was a model professor, someone who guided students through their psychological struggles. But underneath, he was a predator, feeding off the vulnerabilities of those who sought his approval. The truth, when it finally came to light, was much darker than anyone had anticipated. Isabella, in the meantime, became the subject of intense scrutiny. The press latched onto the story, sensationalizing her relationship with Sinclair. The media focused more on her transgender identity than the fact that she had been a victim of his emotional manipulation. Headlines screamed about the scandal, about the transgender student who had been involved with a respected professor. The public was quick to judge, to assign blame where it was convenient, without understanding the complexities of their connection. Isabella became a pariah, even within the university. Her dorm room was vandalized with cruel, transphobic messages. Threats poured in through every channel, email, social media, and even phone calls. People who had once been friendly now avoided her in the halls, their eyes filled with disgust and fear. She had become the villain in a story that was no longer about Sinclair's abuse, it was about her. She tried to hold on to her composure, but the walls were closing in. She wasn't just being investigated for the professor's death, she was being judged, vilified for something she had no control over. The emotional toll was unbearable. She had no family to turn to, no friends who understood her pain. Even at Stanford, the one place she thought she could find refuge, she was alone. The police continued to investigate, digging deeper into Sinclair's personal life. They discovered his secret journals, full of reflections on his relationships with his students, and more disturbingly, his manipulation tactics. One entry stood out, a confession that he had been using Isabella's vulnerability to control her, to keep her dependent on his approval, to make her feel that she couldn't live without him. He had been using her for months, feeding off her emotional fragility. But despite all the evidence, Isabella refused to break. She continued to deny any involvement in Sinclair's death, maintaining her innocence in the face of mounting evidence against her. The police had enough circumstantial evidence to charge her, but they couldn't prove conclusively that she had murdered him. The investigation was ongoing, and the tension between guilt and innocence was palpable. The investigation into Robert Sinclair's death continued to unfold, pulling the entire university into a storm of speculation, scandal, and sorrow. Isabella Carter, caught in the web of emotional manipulation, now faced a legal system that did not understand her pain. The truth of what had transpired, of the manipulation, the control, and the emotional abuse, was buried beneath the sensationalized headlines. As the days dragged on, Isabella found herself increasingly isolated. The pressure from both the media and the university grew unbearable. The whispers that had once been mere rumors now turned into accusations that consumed her every waking moment. The public believed her to be a victim of a predatory relationship, but they also saw her as the one who had ultimately taken the life of the man who had once been her mentor and lover. She had spent weeks trying to reconcile the man she thought she had loved with the person he truly was. Was she just a victim of his manipulation? Or was she an accomplice in a crime she couldn't even remember committing? The questions spiraled in her mind, leaving her feeling more lost than ever. The day of the trial arrived with a sense of finality that Isabella wasn't sure she was prepared for. The courtroom was filled with reporters, spectators, and members of the university community. The once esteemed Professor Sinclair, whose reputation had been shattered, was now a shadow in the eyes of the public. His double life was exposed for all to see, but that didn't change the fact that he was dead, and someone had to answer for his murder. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Isabella as a mentally unstable and obsessive student, driven to rage and jealousy after Sinclair rejected her. The evidence was damning: texts, emails, and even the discovery of her fingerprints on the murder weapon. It seemed clear to the prosecution that Isabella had murdered Sinclair in a fit of rage, unable to accept that their affair was over. They used her emotional turmoil as proof of her instability, exploiting the very thing that had once made her feel human, the pain of being rejected and misunderstood. The defense, on the other hand, focused on Isabella's tragic background. They spoke of her years of abuse, the rejection from her family, and the emotional vulnerability that had made her a target for Sinclair's manipulation. They painted her as a victim, a young woman whose heart had been used and discarded by someone she trusted. They argued that Sinclair had preyed on her vulnerability, offering love and acceptance only to use it to control her. But despite their best efforts, the jury was unconvinced. As the trial came to a close, the tension in the room was palpable. Isabella sat motionless in the defendant's chair, her heart racing with the overwhelming fear of what the jury would decide. Would they see her for the victim she was, or would they judge her as the cold-blooded killer they had been led to believe? When the jury returned with a verdict, the room fell silent. Guilty. The words echoed through her ears like a death sentence. Isabella was found guilty of second-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Some people were relieved that justice had been served, while others saw her conviction as a tragic injustice. The man who had manipulated her into silence, who had made her believe that her worth was dependent on his approval, had taken everything from her, and now the world had condemned her for it. In prison, Isabella would have to grapple with the reality of what had happened, of the love, the manipulation, and the devastating consequences. Her life had been altered forever, and there was no going back. But deep down, she knew the truth: she had never wanted to kill Sinclair. He had been the one who had killed the person she had once been. He had stripped her of her identity and twisted her reality, until she didn't even recognize herself anymore. As the days passed in her cell, Isabella began to question everything. What if things had been different? What if she had been able to break free from Sinclair's control before it was too late? Could she have found a way to reclaim her life without the destruction that followed? What do you think of Isabella's story? Was she truly guilty of murder, or was she a victim of manipulation and emotional abuse? How do you feel about the way society handles the complexities of relationships, especially when it comes to power dynamics and emotional control? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Did the jury make the right decision? Do you believe there could have been a different outcome if the court had understood the psychological manipulation Isabella suffered? We'd love to hear your opinions. Don't forget to like the video and share it with friends to keep the conversation going.